So hello, welcome. We are delighted to have all of you here joining us in this presentation of the book Advanced Macroeconomics, an Easy Guide by Filipe Campante, Federico Sturzenegger, and Andrés Velasco, with comments and reflections from María Antonieta, Alva, and Ilan Goldfajn. This is basically the first book of the School of Public Policy published by the LSE Press, so that makes us very proud, and I'm sure more will come on in the pipeline. First, some housekeeping issues. The hashtag for this event is hashtag LSE Macroeconomics. Today's session will be streamlined on the LSE Facebook page, and we'll also be recording the session in order for a podcast to be available afterwards. And please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions to our panelists for the final part of this panel. And now let's get started. I was asked to give a brief reflection from my experience on the question posed for today's session, which is, what kind of macroeconomics is useful when formulating policy? And basically the short answer that I will give to that is the one that the context needs. When you're practicing public policy, public policy, it's all about striking the right balance, a very difficult balance amongst the macro variables to advance sensible and effective macroeconomic policy in a given context. Basically, the difference between purely academic macroeconomics and macroeconomic policy in real life is context. Definitions, factors, situations, determinants, perceptions, and correlations change dramatically over time, between countries, among countries. And I would only ask you, how would we regard just 2 years ago in 2019 concepts such as growth, supply and demand, investment, revenues, spending, trade, financial markets, labor markets, vis-a-vis the way we regard them today, no? So these have changed dramatically, the scope, the priorities, the concepts themselves. And all of these factors played out very different according to my experience back in November 8, 2016, when I was Deputy Minister of Finance of Mexico, and we faced a massive shock. And that shock was based on the country, which concentrated 80% of our trade, had just elected a president that wanted to get rid of NAFTA and build a wall. Therefore, we had a de-anchoring of economic expectations in Mexico. And this was also at a very particular and very challenging juncture where oil prices had dropped 40%, US growth was declining, particularly manufacturing sector, which was the pulling factor of our exports. Also, our exchange rate had lost 20% of its value, and our credit ratings were at risk. So what served us in this juncture? It was basically macroeconomic policy. And it was not a reactive macroeconomic policy in the juncture, but rather the possibility of selling a story that was based on reality of good macroeconomic policy that had taken the last decade at least. So we were able to sell that as a prudent, as a responsible, as a sound and as a solid macroeconomic policy, because we had just passed a series of deep structural reforms in the financial, fiscal, education, energy, labor sectors. We also had a process of fiscal consolidation, delivering the first primary surplus after many years. We had set forth a Pemex business plan. We can count on a prudent liability management. We had anchored inflation. We had a well-capitalized financial sector. We had stabilization funds, trust funds, IMF credit lines, oil hedges, catastrophe bonds and catastrophe funds, and of course, the swap lines with the IMF. So basically what I want to comment with this juncture we had to face was that good macroeconomic policy pays off well, and good macroeconomic policy was the key to having a better situation and a better scope, and getting rid of that very delicate juncture that could have implied a crisis in Mexico, but fortunately didn't. Counterfactuals are very difficult to measure, but at the end, it played out well, and this is a good success story of good macroeconomic policy that I wanted to share with you. But without any further ado, I am very pleased to introduce you to Federico Sturzenegger, who's, as most of you know, full professor at the Universidad de Andes, visiting professor at Harvard Kennedy School, and honoris causa professor at HEC Paris. And among other things, in his public sector career, he served as governor of the Central Bank of Argentina. So please, Federico, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Marisa. I'm talking from Buenos Aires, so I'm a little bit far away. I think other people in the panel also are far away. I'm based at the Universidad de San Andrés here in Buenos Aires. So my task here is to tell you a little bit about the book before we open up the discussion about what macroeconomic policy you should learn about. And this book actually was born out of the class notes of a course at the Harvard Kennedy School. Those notes were initially written up by Andrés. He had kind of the first version, and when he left to do the campaign for Michelle Bachelet in Chile, I took up the course. I took the notes, I changed them a little bit, and then when I left, I gave the notes to Filipe, which is the one who followed, teaching the same exact course at the Kennedy School. And that was it. And then a few years ago, the three of us got together and we said, look, we have these notes which kind of really cover a lot of material. Why don't we make them a book? And this is the product, okay? And now, of course, that somehow defines a little bit the nature of the book. It's a book which has a very strong policy bent because the students at the MPA ID program at the Kennedy School are people who are fully interested in policy issues or not interested in techniques. Of course, we need to understand the tools to understand the policy issues, but the central focus is on the policy issues. And of course, after both of us leaving the Kennedy School, both Andrés and myself, we also went into a very long career in public service. So when we actually came back to the book, we also had a little bit our own perspective on the relevance of policy to add to the discussion of the topics. And so I want to point out 6 features of this book, which I think kind of distinguishes it as a product. And so the first item, the first distinctive characteristics is basically that it's a book that is focused on policy questions. So it's not a book that tries to be encyclopedic. It says these are the questions that we think a policymaker interested in the field of macroeconomics should know about. And on the basis of choosing those topics and those policy questions, we've built the book. So it's not encyclopedic, it's more like a curated version of the things that we think are mostly relevant. So I think that it's shorter, it's not longer, okay? The second thing that it's kind of a little bit compact in the treatment of the issue. So basically it starts, this is the policy issue. I'll give a couple of examples in a minute. These are the broad themes in the literature. These are kind of the different ideas that you have on the literature. These are the relevant models to understand this issue. So we actually kind of develop the models. And we even have, in some cases, a what next section. So if you're a policymaker, you have this first broad view. Well, here are the references that you need if you need to dwell further into this issue. So policy questions, broad view of the literature, the specific models, and further readings. And kind of we kind of repeat this framework across each one of the chapters and across each one of the topics. So that would be my second, the compactness of the coverage of each topic. The third one is that it's relatively self-contained. So of course you need to know a little bit of algebra, you need to know a little bit of calculus, but if you come to the book with those basic tools, then everything else, all the techniques, all the The methodology in the book is self-contained. We have mathematical appendices, which are not very technical, but try to get you through the material. And in some chapters, for example, that we do RBC or real business cycle or dynamic stochastic general equilibrium estimation, we actually have at the end of the book the program codes so that you can run the models yourself, which we think is very important for students to kind of say, oh, I've done this, so when they have a discussion later on, they're not afraid of what's in the model because they realize that, there's not much, but they've kind of are familiar with this. And we actually have video tutorials of how to do this thing. So I think the self-contained, the feature that it's self-contained is another, I think, asset of the book. The fourth element that I want to stress is that, well, this is natural. It's a book which is a little bit up to date because it's just been written and it's just been finished. And so that has allowed us to incorporate in this macro textbook a number of issues which have not yet been discussed in the textbooks so far. So when you think about new developments in monetary policy, quantitative easing, the fiscal theory of the price level, models of secular stagnation, which are things that have been discussed extensively in the literature over the last 10 years, you don't find them typically in the standard textbooks, and I think we've had the chance of introducing those here. So it allows the reader to kind of come up to date with some of the recent literature I think in a very easy way, in a very, as I said, compacted way. Other issues like the discussion on capital taxation, whether you should tax labor, you should tax capital, which has had a long discussion in the literature and somehow has come to an agreement. Also, we have been able to introduce that. So I think the up-to-dateness and hopefully the feature that it's online will allow us to keep the book updated as we go along. The fifth issue is that it's free, in the sense that you can download the book for free from the page. We've discussed this. We wanted it to be free. Thanks God. LSE Press also wanted it to be free. That means that it's a very accessible teaching resource and reading resource around the world. So we were keen on having that. And also for teachers, we provide the slides that you need to teach from this book are also available online. They're already on the website. And I think also that makes it useful for teaching purposes. And my last point is that it's somehow influenced by our background and our personal experience. And I just want to give you two examples. And with that, Vanessa, I will close. The first one is, for example, we have two chapters which are devoted to inflation, which of course, maybe if you are kind of focusing on a book written kind of from exclusively the perspective of Europe and the US, maybe over recent years, it would have not been such a relevant topic, but for us coming, say, from Latin America, it was a more important topic, so we still had the theory. Well, out of a fluke of coincidence, probably those chapters will become more relevant in the next year or so. So I mean, that's kind of a little. And the other example I wanted to give is, for example, we have two chapters on the overlapping generations model, which is one of the main workhorses. Of course, the book starts discussing intertemporal optimization to understand growth theory, then it does overlapping generations, then it goes into consumption and investment theory, and then it goes to more, let's say, business cycles models like the real business cycle, the new Keynesian models, and ends up with a discussion of fiscal and monetary policy. But for example, if you take the two chapters on overlapping generation models, what was the question we were interested in? The question we were interested was the transition of social security systems. And for example, you have a social security, you don't have a social security system, then you establish a social security system and you establish a pay-as-you-go or a capitalization system. But maybe you have a pay-as-you-go system and you want to move to a capitalization system. So if you look, for example, at the discussion in, say, in the US and Europe, it's always about the effects of moving from not having a social security system to having a pay-as-you-go system. So instituting, and what's the effect on the capital stock and welfare and so forth. But our experience in Latin America showed that some countries has actually moved out of the pay-as-you-go system to a capitalization system. So we need to study the transition, which is absent in the literature. It's absent in the literature because no one in the US or in Europe ever thought that that could be an interesting problem to think about, but it has been in our country. And the implications of that are, from a theoretical point of view, practical and policy point of view, are actually, in some cases, pretty surprising what you find out when you actually go through that exercise. So I think the book is kind of full of those highlights where somehow models which are more traditional in the literature are seen to and applied to problems which are, perhaps are different, and which allow it to kind of be more comprehensive and useful for a I would say an audience around the world. So let me just stop there. I think I took too much time, but I think that has given you a kind of a little bit of a view of some of the features of the text.
Thank you so much, Federico. And of course, a book that is based on policy questions, that is compact, that is self-contained, that is up to date, that you can keep updating it because it is online, and it's for free, and it's by 3 great economists. I think it cannot get any better. So thank you so much for this overview. And now it's the turn of María Antonieta Alva, former Minister of Economy and Finance of Peru, who has also served in 2 other key ministries in her country, in education and development and social inclusion. So please, María Antonieta, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon. It's an honor to be here with this amazing economist. I am talking from Pakistan. I hope that the internet works. So first, I want to introduce my comments of what is the kind of training that we need as policymakers. I want to tell you a little bit about my background. So to be honest, I've never had in mind to become Minister of Finance for my country. I was very passionate about being a public servant. I decided very young during my career to join the Ministry of Finance. At some point, I went to the Kennedy School to study MPID, where Filipe was my professor there. And when I came back, I was very in public budget issues. I became also the General Director of Budget for my country. I was in charge of overseeing all the budget, and I was really very happy in that position. And then an political event happened, and I think that in Peru, in the last years, the only stable issue in Peru is that political instability is always there. So the president shut down the Congress, and they had to bring a new guy. And he offered me the position as Minister of Finance. My first answer was, President, I don't think this is a good idea. There's a lot of uncertainty in the markets. You need an economist that is well known in the markets. As I mentioned, I was very focused on public finance and public budget. So I was not very known in the international markets. I was not known in the private sector, but the president told me, like, no, I want you as my minister. And that is when my public service profile came. It's a time when I had to serve my country. At that time, my country needed me in that position, and I became Minister of Finance. I was the third in 200 years of independence of Peru. I was the third woman to become Minister of Finance. And after 5 months of being there, the COVID-19 crisis started. And also at the same time, what some journalists call in Peru, we deal with another pandemic. The pandemic was a political instability in the Congress. I was, as minister, I was interpelled twice by the Congress. So it was a very difficult year as Minister of Finance. And I meant a little bit on that. So I think that thinking about specifically what is the kind of training and skills that you need to have as a policymaker, I think that the first one is that economic growth and policies that foster economic growth, I think that should always be up on top of your mind. So in those years that I was General Director of Budget during 3 years, I was very conscious about how the budget, public expenditure, how execution of public investment what had their role in this puzzle of economic growth. So I'm very conscious about that. And I think that that is very important. So you can be in different positions, but having a broad understanding of economic growth and how are policies important for that? I think that is this important. Then after being focused on public budget, suddenly I became Minister of Finance. So I had to oversee a variety of topics: financial markets, employment generation, tax policy. I was very focused, as I mentioned, in public budget, but I think that the training that I received at Kennedy School gave me a broad understanding of a range of issues, and also equipped me to quickly extend this broad knowledge base. I was trained in having the frameworks to be able to catch quickly in the issue. So even though I was very focused in my last years in public budget, when I became minister and I had to deal with tax policy, financial markets, I think I had this broad understanding, and then I have all the tools to really learn very, very fast and to have a smart consumer of this complex information. I think that it was also important that I was trained, and I was thinking about specifically about my classes with Filipe to be trained in these trending topics. And for me, it was very, very important. And I really always remembered Filipe in the pensions example, for example, when I was trained in these intergenerational models, and what you know in Latin America, what happened during the COVID-19 crisis. There were these populist waves where politicians generated a lot of pressure to return back to the people the money from the pension funds. And because this training that I received at Kennedy School, I know immediately what was the impact of the next generation, and that I had really to take that fight, even though like the Congress, of course, didn't like me because I was always telling that their policies, this idea of returning the money from the pension fund was not really a good idea. The third thing, I think that as a policymaker, it's always important to strike a balance between the short-term and the long-term view perspective. In the COVID-19 crisis, of course, you be correctly equipped with the tools to have a response to the crisis, to think about the contracyclical policies, but you should never forget about how to foster economic growth. And usually the day-to-day will always push you to be a firefighter. So I think it's very important that in your mindset, you understand that you have to have this good balance between short-term response and long-term perspective. I think that it's also very important to have a clear understanding of constraints and dilemmas that you face. And a very concrete example is rules versus discretion. For example, during the COVID-19 crisis, you know that Peru is a country that during decades has followed a very disciplined fiscal rule and a very disciplined management of the economy. And in front of the COVID-19 crisis, it was very challenging for us to commit to those rules. So I had to take this decision after decades of following the fiscal rules. I had to take the decision of suspending the fiscal rules. So having this understanding of what are the dilemmas is also very important because you also have a lot of discretion. So from one day to another, we changed from compliance of fiscal rules to decision, because that was that context, as Vanessa mentioned, that context, we needed that. I also think, and that is also from my experience from the COVID-19 crisis, that you need to be equipped to understand fiscal and monetary policy. It's important that people at the Ministry of Finance that manages fiscal policy understands monetary policy, and that central bankers understand fiscal policy. For example, during the COVID-19 crisis, we implemented a massive loan program for enterprises with government guarantee, 8 points of the GDP. It was that we coordinated with the central bank. So we had lots of meetings, of technical meetings, and I think that at the end, it was relatively easy for us to come to an agreement, because both teams at the Ministry of Finance and at the central bank knew about the others' issues, like policy and fiscal policy and monetary policy. I think that another thing, as a policymaker, I think that you need to be very aware of politics. you need to understand that decisions, unfortunately, are not always technical. And you have to understand the limitations, and you have to identify until which point you can be flexible, you can negotiate. You have to understand what are the impacts of different alternatives, so you can identify what is your red line. And in fact, I had to identify my red lines when the Congress approved a retirement of pension funds. I really need to understand, if I were fighting for that battle, what was the impact for the economy? So being aware of politics is also very important. And then what was also very useful is to, especially in the COVID-19 crisis, it's, as a policymaker, I think that you need to be trained to explain these difficult concepts to the citizens or to non-special persons. For instance, when I had to go to the Congress to explain them why their laws were a bad idea, I had to be able to explain them in simple words. Or when I went, for instance, to the television show to explain the economic package of 20% the GDP, it's very important that you are trained to explain difficult concepts in simple words. And finally, I think, like, as a policymaker, you need to be, and this is like, you need to be very human. And I think that people that work with you need to understand, need to know that at the end of your day, you are really caring about the well-being. And I put you this example. During the COVID-19 crisis, I had to go every 3 or 4 days to the Cabinet of Ministers to approve urgent decrees that suspended fiscal rules, urgent decrees that approve massive spending packages. And I sit there with 16 other ministers, no economists, there's the president that was an engineer. And I think that at the end of the day, because they know that at the Ministry of Finance, we have a real obsession about protecting the economy, protecting the households, I think that they trust us. And during the crisis, you need to react quickly, and you need sometimes to approve measures on the Cabinet of Ministers in hours. So I think that if they trust that your team really cares about the well-being of your citizen, I think that they are going to trust. Because sometimes I will go with urgent decrees, very difficult, very complex, and they will have 1 hour to approve them. And I think that the most important, and I learned a lot from these huge crises, is, as a policymaker, you need to be very committed to your values and your convictions. Sometimes what is good for the country, you're really truly convinced what is the adequate policy, that is not very approved by politicians, or it's very difficult. In my case, for instance, imagine in the middle of the crisis, people wanted money to go to the Congress and say, I am not going to approve giving you money for your pension funds because this is not good for the country. And because of that decision, I also didn't support that decision. I also didn't support it. The Congress wanted to implement, to control the prices. So that Congress was starting to approve very populist measures and going there and saying no. And the consequence for that, I was interpelled twice. So I think that because I was clear about my convictions and my values, I was able, and what was the adequate policy to implement or not to implement, that conviction, that strong belief in what is correct for your country allows you to deal with these political difficult moments, like being interpelled by the Congress. So there are my thoughts. I think, to be honest, when I was minister, it was a very difficult task for me, but I think that I was, after pursuing the MPAID at Kennedy School, and especially this course that I took with Filipe, I think I was in a better place to take this role. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, María Antonieta. I very much enjoyed the fact that you started saying that you were passionate about what you were doing, that you were committed, how much you regarded the relevant training you received, being human, being a leader, because it is clear that you were a leader throughout this process. Be prepared for the unexpected, for dealing with the politics of policies, and of course, communication, how important communication it is in public policies, especially at very complex juncture, and being committed to one's values and your integrity, preserving your integrity. So thank you for sharing that very personal experience, and definitely I think we shall discuss more about this during the panel. So now it is my pleasure to turn to Ilan Goldfajn, recently appointed Director of the Western Hemisphere of the IMF, and who served as Governor of the Banco Central do Brasil. Please, Ilan, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Vanessa. It is a pleasure to be here for several reasons. I will just start saying that I agree with most of what María and Antonieta shared, the passion, the need to really like what you're doing, to care about the people, the empathy. Those are basic needs. You need to be able to communicate. You need to be able to really deal with all the constraints that we want to find in any one place, not even in the wonderful book that Filipe, Federico, and Andrés wrote. You cannot be able to put all these restrictions. I would share with you, if I'm successful, some slides that I wrote. Let's see if it works. I think this is it. So if I was successful, you're now with my first slide. So this is a nice book by Filipe, Federico, and Andrés. For me, it's special because I met Filipe at the beginning of his career. We were both young professionals at PUCI, which is the Pontifical Catholic University. With Federico, we've been sharing experiences since MIT. We were both governors at the same time, so we have to meet at BIS, even though we are closer in South America. We will meet everywhere in the world. And of course, with Andrés, has been a reference and has been dealing with Latin America for a long time. With all my Chilean friends, it's always a pleasure. The book fills a very important gap. It is advanced, maybe in the sense that Freddie mentioned. It's modern. It deals with the issues that are more relevant. It's up to date. The book says it's easy. I think it's easy relative to the counterparties, other books. It's hard to have an advanced book which is easy, but at the same time, it is relevant to policy. And this is where I think the book is different from the rest. It's written to people from public schools, from public policy, and it's written by both Federico and Andrés that have been in public office a long time with an important contribution to their country. So it immediately appears to us that it's important. Now, it's not a book just loose. It clearly has its rigor. So when you read it, everything is in a model. It has its result. You can look at it. I didn't even realize that you can run all this appendix with the DSG models and all of that, but that's wonderful too. And of course, when you read the beginning and you see the tribute to Rudy, was my advisor, to Diaz Alejandro, anybody in Latin America has to relate to Diaz Alejandro and his work, and more recently to Alesina and what happened. The book is relevant for authorities when in public office. And the question you ask is, what is relevant? I want to first mention that you need to arrive with a framework in mind. My experience is that if you try to figure out what is your framework, once you are there in government, you are lost. I mean, there's no way to learn, there's no way to just take classes of Filipe, Federico, or Andrés in the middle of what happened, or just give a call. You need to somehow have a framework in mind. What is exactly the framework? It's something that is evolving. You had the big financial crisis in 2008, things have changed. Now we have the COVID. I don't envy María Antonieta, I don't envy anybody else that has to deal with that major shock in office. I had my share of shocks, but they were not COVID shocks. So I don't envy anybody now in office. And that changes the framework. Things change. I'm sure in the book you have adapted part of what is your framework, what is your teaching to the new reality. I mean, at the end of the book, you're talking about secular stagnation, you're talking about QE and lower bound, and a lot of issues that are in front, in the frontier. And I agree with you, Freddie, that inflation, you started apologizing on talking about inflation, but you don't have to apologize. This is Latin America. And to be honest, this is exactly what we're going to deal for the next 2 years. If we are lucky, 2 years. If we are not lucky, a decade talking about inflation. So what is important to arrive with a framework, a modern and advanced framework, is that you do face quite a bit of constraints, political also. At the central bank, I did not have a lot of political pressures. But when I went to Congress to approve what we call the BCB agenda, and when my colleagues at the economic ministry had to pass their reforms, there are clearly political issues and constraints. So they have to deal it every day. There are pressures, and here is where central bank also, market pressures, inflation pressures, interest rate pressures, capital flows, exchange rate, all of those are daily issues that you have to deal. So if you do have in mind a framework, you have a previous strategy ready, has a starting point where you put the other constraints to work. Once you strategy, when you know where to go, what do you want to achieve, then it is easier to deal with the routine, to the day-to-day issues. Because the day-to-day issues, they are all urgent. I mean, I'm sure Andrés and Federico can relate, and María Antonieta also. Every day you wake up, there's something urgent. Somebody calls you, you need to act, you need to do. They are very urgent, but they're also very important issues. Unfortunately, not all the urgent issues are important, and not all the important issues are urgent, which means that you need to have a framework in place to be able to reserve your priorities to the important issues and which are not urgent, because the urgent issues will be addressed. Somebody will call you, you have to take a decision, but the important issues that you want to go, where you want to do, you have to reserve space, energy, time. This textbook provides the needed framework. I don't think undergraduate books are enough. They're just not enough to have a framework. And graduate books, they just do not focus on policy. They focus on the framework, and they're evolving, and they're changing, and they're the frontier. But you need a book to have this bridge between the framework, what is done in academics, and how do you use it in policy. My experience in public policy has been at the central bank. I was deputy governor back in the 2002, 2003, actually from 2000 to 2003. Then I came back later as a governor, more recently, in 2016, 2019. And when you look at when I started, it was immediately relevant, the issue of rules versus discretion, which is part of one of chapter of the book, which is relevant. The need to have rules that will diminish the inflation bias, but the rules also allow you to have the flexibility. And here flexibility means being able to do monetary policy, stabilization policy. Credibility allows for flexibility, and that you need to start. It's not the other way around. It's not that the flexibility gives you credibility. Is you first need to get the credibility in the long run issues, convince people that there is a rule, there's no lower bias in the future in order to be able to deal with the short run. Of course, and I think this was also mentioned by María Antonieta, that you need to have a relationship with fiscal policy, the importance of fiscal policy. We call it to anchor, have a fiscal anchor, whether it's the price level, determinant of fiscal policy or things like that, could be. But I want to give you an example of building credibility before easing in monetary policy. And I'm, of course, will give you an example with my own experience, which is why I think you wanted me to comment. So in my case, this is monetary policy. You had here, this is the Selic rate, and here is expectations. And in the monetary policy, inflation targeting regime, inflation expectations are very important. You want to do some finance because you want to have expected inflation which are not close enough to your shock that will be affected by expectations. So for example, what is the expectation of inflation today for 2021, 2022? Of course, is somehow not clean because you do have the impact of the shock, which could be more persistent, either in Latin America, Brazil, the US. So you want to see expected inflation in, let's say, what people expect 22 years from now for the third year. So this is expectations, forward expectations in 3 years from now. And what you see is that sometimes you do have expectations going up, but here is fiscal policy affecting monetary policy. But it's also true that monetary policy that starts easing, which pushes monetary policy because the economy needs some help, because in 2013 you had a recession, not necessarily is useful because expectations are going up. And at the end of the day, the easing is short-lived. You have to raise interest rates again. And that's what happened to my predecessor. He had to come back and raise interest rates all the way from 7% to 14.25. When he was raising rates, of course, he got some benefit. Inflation went down from 5.5 to around 5. But then issues with fiscal policy, with political issues, the impeachment, and you get back to expectations which are much higher. Again, those are not very high expectations because we're talking about a longer term. If you look at shorter, you'll have like 10% expected inflation. But this is getting the noise out. You still have for the long term the loss of the anchor out of the target. So the change in government was 2016. I was appointed the governor here, and we stayed quite a bit with the same interest rates. And this was one of the main criticism of the market because they believed that we should have been easing sooner. They thought we were too hawkish. And basically what we wanted is to see expected inflation going down to the target, which was 4.5%, 4%. This was a declining target. And only after gaining credibility, only after you actually have this perception that you will really look for the long run anchor, then you are able to reduce rates and actually go below the previous levels. And at the end, in 2019 here, inflation interest rates were down to 6%. Then they continued to go down to 5%, 4%. And then in the COVID, of course, I was not there anymore. Interest rates went all the way to 2%. If you want to see it in a more conventional way, you can just see expectations 12 months from now. Sorry, this is in Portuguese. In 6 months from now, 12 months expectation 6 months from now. So it's not so clean, but it's easy to see because you will see expected inflation, you'll see the target, you'll see the bounce. For some time, expectations were always higher than the middle. And then when I was asked whether we should immediately easing, or the actual question was, will you be flexible immediately? And I say, well, I think we'll have reasons to come back to the target relatively soon. And that basically put the expectations here. Of course, the COVID affected and you went below the target for some time. And now things are really, really worsening. You have expectations, even in 6 months, 12 months inflation, 6 months ahead, you are now having a higher inflation going down. But rules versus discretion, what to do, first look at the anchor, then have the flexibility was quite important in this case. Now, the other examples, so for example, monetary policy, exchange rate policy. These are very different animals from the point of view of public policy. One has a framework, everybody has worked. You may like the framework, you may change the framework, but there's a lot of beef just to work with. On the other hand, exchange rate policy, how much to intervene? Do you intervene? Is it pure floating? Are you committing a crime by accumulating reserves and then intervention? One thing I'm sure, most emerging markets intervene and most emerging markets accumulate reserves. So why we don't have a framework? I know there is a little bit. I know, for example, the IMF, they have what they call the integrated framework, where they try to piece that. But my experience at the central bank is not really a framework, not really a book that will tell you what to do. So you will basically intervene when market failure, when you feel that you need to address, you don't want to have fear of floating, you don't have to fix exchange rate, you want it to reflect it, but you have reserves. So should you just allow it to markets panic sometimes? Another issue that's also was part of my experience that we had a structural agenda. We call this the BCB plus agenda, where we were dealing with technology, with helping newcomers, with giving them knowledge, technology, with beefing up competition. And we basically knew that this was important for getting growth, either in the financial system or in other places out. And I think the dismal results in growth in Latin America are partly because we have not really addressed, we have not given the priority to these issues. And finally, the last example, of course, fiscal policy. When is expansionary, when is contractionary, when emerging markets need to define a nominal anchor. In my country, for example, Brazil, we're basically out of anchor in an election year. It's going to be very tough. Even if after the election you're going to anchor again, it's not going to be easy. At the same time, the economy needs support. You have new priorities, social issues, climate issues, all need money. What do? You need a nominal anchor. You need the instrument. But unfortunately, you have not prepared before. So you did not get credibility and rule before you can use the instrument. And this is really difficult. So just ending here, it's a wonderful book. It's exactly the framework we need. There's no one framework. It's an evolving framework. And I think this book gives you the latest in that regard.
Thank you so much, Ilan. I definitely agree that this book fills a gap. It is an easy book as much as an advanced macroeconomics course can be. And definitely it is not only useful for students and professors, but it's also a very useful book as a guide on theory and concepts and models for macroeconomic policy for policymakers themselves. And you raised very important issues that require a very specific analysis in terms of those that are not urgent, but require time, thinking, resources, and actions, the elements of credibility and of managing expectations, and the fact that at the end is a matter of deciding between different shades of gray and fine-tuning in monetary policy, in exchange rate policy, in growth at a broader level, and of course fiscal policy. So thank you for your comments. And now it's the turn of Filipe Campante, author, of course, of this book, Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of International Economics at Johns Hopkins University and Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Please, Felipe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. It's really a pleasure to be here. Obviously, kind of talking about the book that Federico and Andrés and I have really put so much work on over the years. But to me, as I was mentioning before we started the event, there's a bit of a circle of life quality here in that my first experience teaching macroeconomics was as a teaching assistant to Ilan, as at the Catholic University in Rio, way too many years ago. So Ilan was one of my mentors there. And then Tony, of course, was one of my students. And it's really beautiful to see, how kind of our students can go out in the world and do tremendous work. And kind of, so this is very, nourishing for any teacher, I guess. And I'm very struck by how sort of with the diversity of experiences that Ilan and Tony have had, and obviously Federico and Andrés will share theirs as well, how much common themes I think are there, that the two of them touched upon. And I think it really underscore kind of what we're trying to achieve in terms of making this a book that really kind of fills the gap that Ilan was referring to. That's really something that allows people who are interested in policy to kind of have a resource that is not really there when it comes to undergraduate tax or the traditional graduate or a PhD level tax. So some of these things that I think are worth underscoring. First, Antonio mentioned this, and I think Ilan as well, kind of the range of issues that you need to be sort of conversant on. And this really speaks to the kind of approach that Federico mentioned that we try to do in the book, which is really kind of try to touch upon many policy issues and kind of try to have that compendium that really becomes kind of a one-stop shop for the interested student or policymaker to go to and kind of find not only sort of the specific themes, but something that kind of brings that commonality, right? And I think, again, both Ilan and Tony mentioned sort of the importance of having a framework. And I think it's exactly what I think the book kind of tries to bring about, is just to show that there is a kind of a common language that macroeconomics uses that can sort of coherently speak to a range of different issues, right? And I like to frame it in terms of kind of thinking dynamically, right? Thinking about dynamic problems, right? All the problems in macroeconomics fundamentally are dynamic. As Ilan pointed out, right, you're talking about expectations. As Tony pointed out, you're talking about intergenerational choices, and you need to have all these things in mind. And you see, I think, in the book, how the same sort of themes keep popping up again and again in different topics. But with the help of the tools that we develop in the book, I think we can see sort of these commonalities. And I think it helps build that framework that I think both Ilan and Tony kind of very eloquently argue that you need to have kind of stepping into a position of policy responsibility. So I think that's very much speaks to what we're trying to achieve there. And another issue that I think is very important is the growth aspect, right? Which Tony mentioned, sort of, it's really kind of top of mind for her as she was in that position. And Ilan, I think, highlighted this very clearly when they say, like, look, there are certain issues that are urgent, but perhaps not that important, and others that are really important that might not be so urgent. And I think growth is really square kind of into that, part of the Venn diagram there, right? And this was very clear, I think, from both of their remarks. And I think once we think about growth with the kind of toolkit that we're bringing to the book, you start seeing that a lot of policy dimensions are fundamentally about growth policy, right? So pensions are about growth because they're about capital accumulation. Ilan mentioned competition, fostering innovation. So all these things, there are policy domains that might seem kind of disparate, but they're sort of brought together by the way they feed into and sort of interact with the fundamental issue of economic growth. And to finish off, I think like the sort of the human aspect of it is something that I think all of us, share and try to bring into this as well, to really kind of put at the forefront that it's not about the models per se, it's not about the tools per se, it's really about what they can do to people and for people and for countries and for communities and so on and so forth. So I think that's, again, something that I think is very important, that sort of motivated us to kind of try and fill that gap and bring advanced macroeconomics in an easy way, which is sort of our little perhaps tongue-in-cheek way of making that point, kind of bringing that to a context where it can be applied and where we can bring sort of like what's out there in the frontier of macroeconomics in a more accessible way, perhaps for as many people as we can all over the world. So let me stop here, and because I'm also looking forward to what Andrés has to say here in particular. But thanks a lot for the remarks, Tony and Ilan, and all of you who have come here today.
Thank you, Filipe, and definitely the growth part being a transversal element and a fundamental issue is something that is very well regarded in the book. And of course, what you mentioned, the human aspect of it, and the fact that it's not only models, but it's basically decision makers, not making decisions about a huge wide variety of policies that affect people's lives on a daily basis. And sometimes you just choose between different shades of gray, and it's not the best policies, but the feasible policies and the ones that you can implement in a given context. So thank you so much. And now the also author of the book and our dear Dean of the School of Public Policy, former Minister of Finance of Chile, Andrés Velasco, the forum is yours.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, everyone. Good evening if you're in the UK. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you might be. Let me begin where I should begin, namely with thanks. First of all, to my two co-authors, Federico and Filipe, who worked hard, put in a lot of talent. Whenever I didn't show up to a Zoom meeting, they did all the work they were supposed to do and all the work that I was supposed to do, and they did it better than I ever could have. So thank you, guys. This book is a testimony both to your economic skills and to your perseverance. I also want to thank the LSE Press, and particularly the man who runs the LSE Press, Patrick Dunleavy, his team. The LSE Press is a new press which is doing things in a most innovative way, with an emphasis on open access books. This is one of the early books in that collection. So thank you, Patrick, for the work that you and everybody who works with you had to put in to publish a pretty complicated book when it comes to publishing. Lots of equations, lots of diagrams, lots of technical issues to deal with. It's all come out very, very well. And certainly a big round of thanks also to the three outstanding policymakers, Ilan, Tony, and Vanessa, who have joined us tonight to discuss this book and also to discuss what kinds of economics is useful when formulating policy. As Filipe and Federico and everybody else mentioned, this is a real theory book, but it is also meant to be a useful book. It is not for academics consumption alone. It is meant to feed the work of people who are out there in the field trying to make a difference in central banks, in ministries of finance, in ministries of the economy, et cetera. When we finished writing the book and it came to titling the book, one alternative was, Advanced Macroeconomics, an Easy Guide. Another alternative was the ABC of Advanced Macroeconomics. A little contradictory. ABC is not supposed to be advanced, but then again, it's not supposed to be easy either, and that's the title we chose. And of course, ABC had two rings which I rather like. One is that we were going for the core elements, we were going for the most fundamental elements, and secondly, of course, one author here is from Argentina, one is from Brazil, and one is from Chile. So we had the ABC team also writing the book. I want to spend a minute or two on my thoughts about what economics, what kind of economics should be taught at a place like the LSE School of Public Policy, what kind of economics was taught and continues to be taught at a place like the Kennedy School at Harvard, which will be useful. And needless to say, this is a subject that I thought about long and hard, as an academic first, as a policymaker next, and as the dean of a public policy school now. And I want to provide an answer with three parts, and I will be telegraphic so that we can then get on with the Q&A. The first thing that we have to teach is that abstraction and models are necessary. Even if you're in a public policy school, even if you're going to be a practitioner, you need abstractions and models. For one very simple reason, the world is complicated. And unless you boil it down to the essentials, you simplify, you weed out the inessential stuff, you will never be able to understand the relevant phenomena. And as a result, we use models because models are simplifications of the world. And a good model is simple, but captures a lot. A good model is clean, a good model is usable, but it is always highly abstract. Some people tend to think that abstraction is over here and practice and policy making are over there. That, in my view, and I think Filipe and Federico and everybody else on this call would agree, those concepts are not enemies. If you are in public policy, you go to a lot of meetings, and when you go to meetings, you can tell right away when people open their mouths, who has a model in mind and who doesn't. People who have a model in mind, they may be right, they may be wrong, but at least they're coherent, they're organized. They have 3 points and point 2 follows from point 1. When you talk to people in policymaking circles who have never had any formal training, they can say beautiful things, but you wonder, does point 3 really follow from point 2? And how in the world are they related to point 1? So the world is complicated. Models don't solve every problem, but models help. Second point I want to make, and I've been very deliberate in using model in the plural. It is not one model, it is models. If you look at our book, you will find that a few techniques recur, a few ideas are all over the place. The idea that people maximize utility, they do so over time, they make choices. But you will find really that set of techniques applied, and I'd never counted them, but probably 4 or 5 basic models and a couple dozen little models appended to the big models. And this is also a very key point, and this is one that our former colleague at the Kennedy School, Danny Roderick, has written about most eloquently. if you try to have one theory of everything, you will probably have a theory of nothing. Maybe because there's no one model that can explain the world, or maybe because the model would be so complicated that it would cease being a useful model. Because as I said earlier, by definition, useful models are simple. So what a good practitioner does is pick the right simple model for the right situation. And a lot of the talent of the theorist is in providing the model. A lot of the talent of successful practitioners like Ilan, like Tony, like Vanessa, is picking the right model, saying that model was useful for that, this little model is useful for this. And the talent of the policymaker, which is honed through practice, you can learn it in the classroom, but you also learn it in the classroom, has a lot to do with just having the intuition to say, this is the right framework, a simple little framework to think about this particular question. The third question, or the third point that I want to raise is, well, if the model has to be simple, how simple? Because, all good things are good, but there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. So simplicity is wonderful, but how much simplicity? And rather than try to answer that question in the abstract, let me tell you an anecdote. And with that anecdote, I will close. I was the Minister of Finance of Chile when Lehman Brothers went under. I used to joke with my then boss, the president of Chile, that she never warned me when she gave me the job that the world economy would melt down on our watch, and that we would spend not only whole days, but whole nights struggling to craft a response. Shortly after Lehman Brothers melted down, I flew to Washington. I did what everybody on this call has done a million times, went to the IMF World Bank meetings, talked to colleagues, sniffed around, talked to bankers. And on the flight back to Santiago with my friend Pepo de Gregorio, who is also an MIT graduate and a colleague of both Ilan's and Federico, we agreed that we had to go for, he had cut interest rates, the Central Bank of Chile, which is autonomous, had agreed to cut interest rates. Now it was the turn of fiscal policy. And as I was sitting on that flight, and as I was sitting in the car, from the airport to my house, and as I sat up, on my bed until 3 a.m. the night that I arrived back in Santiago, I found myself drawing ISLM diagrams. Because clearly, I didn't need an ISLM diagram to know that what you needed was a fiscal expansion. That's pretty obvious. But the effects of a fiscal expansion will depend, for instance, on the exchange rate regime in place, on the monetary regime in place. As we have learned, or as we have been reminded of since those days, when the interest rate is zero and the economy is in a liquidity trap, the effect of monetary policy is different. The effect of fiscal policy is also very different. So, what kind of model is useful? Well, sometimes very simple models, the kind of introduction model, ISLM. But as several of you said already, I think Ilan said it, the undergraduate ISLM model is also very simple, and perhaps too simple in dimensions that, I was reminded of that night at 3 a.m. when I drew my 25th diagram of ISLM. It is too simple and misleadingly simple and dangerously simple in at least two ways. First of all, in a rich country, and this is a standard open economy ISLM model that we teach undergraduates, the so-called Mundell-Fleming model, in an advanced country with a lot of credibility, a fiscal expansion typically appreciates the exchange rate. In Argentina or Brazil, if I may say so, a very large fiscal expansion typically causes the exchange rate to depreciate. So in what sense is the basic model wrong? Well, the basic model is static. The basic model has no future. And because it has no future, has no way of incorporating what people think will happen to monetary policy in the future in reaction to the fiscal expansion. And in particular, the very simple model has no budget constraint. So if the government accumulates a lot of debt today, there's some chance it will pay for that debt by printing money in the future. And if people come to expect that, the reaction of the economy, of inflation, of the exchange rate will be very, very different than in the basic standard ISLM model. The other issue, of course, that the ISLM model is missing is that if you're going to worry about the future, you have to worry about the constraints and the incentives of people who will be making decisions in the future. You know, you think you know what you would like to do, you think you know what your government can get through Congress, but you have to conjecture also what other governments in the future may want to do, or what central bankers in the future might want to do, and what they will be able to do. You know, central bank is autonomous, but the government has to get things through parliament. So political economy, of course, is a second ingredient that is missing from the simple ISLM model. So my answer to the question, what kind of economics do we need, is we need something that is simple, almost as simple as what you teach undergraduates, but realistic enough. It needs a time dimension. It needs, sorry for the jargon, an intertemporal budget constraint, and it needs the rudiments of political economy that incorporate the incentives and the constraints that future policymakers will be facing when making their decisions, and which current citizens and markets will take into account in guessing what policy will be like in the future. One way of describing this book is precisely an attempt at building models which are more complicated than ISLM, but simpler than the very fancy, fully dynamic, fully optimizing models that PhD students get taught. And maybe the kinds of models that we build in this book, and this is what we hope for, achieve that balance. Pretty simple, but not too simple, complicated enough to take into account the dynamic aspects, the budget aspects, the expectational aspects, and the political economy aspects, which are absolutely key to policy making. I'm not sure we have achieved that task 100%, but I would like to think that we have achieved at least a bit of it. And of course, I see that we have, nearly 100 people listening in. We had 118 at the peak. I hope all 118 of you will have a chance to look at the book, use it, and like Ilan did with Filipe and Filipe did with Tony, teach future generations of policymakers to carry out good, sound macro policy. Thank you, Vanessa. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrés. Not much to add besides the fact that I would underline that we need complex models that are at the same time simple, but at the same time feasible at a specific point in time in a specific context, given constraints and given, of course, political economy. Definitely, that's the right balance that you are achieving in the book. So due actually to our own time constraints, I am going to be passing directly to the questions from the audience. We have a congratulation by Sydney from Brazil, and we have 2 questions from Brazil as well that I would like to broaden a little bit. This was just in the context of Brazil, but perhaps we can broaden to the current discussion on monetary policy. Mm-hmm. So Joao Tejera says, how much of the current inflation in Brazil is due to lowering Selic prime rate, and how much is due to shocks caused by COVID crisis? And perhaps if I would add there, one of the questions I had is something you touched in your book on the way inflation has played out, the way inflation targeting was consensus prior to the 2008-2009 crisis. And my question was, aren't we in a similar situation today where orthodox monetary policy aiming at controlling inflation might be out of scope, given the factors that are actually originating the current inflationary pressures? So that would be an open question to the panel, and then we'll go to James Piazza's question and Pablo Mendieta's.
Might any of the central bankers present wish to, maybe not about Brazil itself, but about the situation generally?
Yeah, I think there is, I think the key question today, globally, not only in our countries, Latin America, is how much of this inflation that we are seeing is more persistent and how much will probably die out. And I I regard this question as the question for the short-term global economy because it affects not only an emerging market that will have less consequence for the rest of the world, but it affects the major advanced economies, which will make the life of emerging markets much more difficult or not, depending on the answer to the question. It is clear to us that there was a major shock, very different from before, 100-year shock that you did not have before, that was the COVID. It generated very specific consequences, and it is very natural to think that these consequences of the major COVID shock will eventually die out. So if you look at the consequences of the supply chain issues, not all the industry recovered or the mobility happened at the same time. It is true also that when you have regional differences, it affected the pricing coming from supply disruptions. Not everybody had the mobility at the same time. It's also true that we had a major change in demand pattern. People start consuming iPhones instead of traveling. That made a huge demand that is difficult to match in the very short term. More industry, less services. That makes a lot of difference. We also know that there are issues from the COVID, from the labor market, people that are less willing to go back to the market immediately for reasons X, Y, or Z. And all of these, I will say, all of these factors, I will put in the benign camp. Is the camp that once we recover from COVID, and I do believe that eventually COVID will become one of these, not pandemic, one of these flus that will be for us forever, with a less deadly consequence. The problem with this is that there is an alternative. And the alternative is that this is a much more persistent behavior. And if this is the case, the consequence for the global economy and for emerging markets is so dear that even if you just have 5% or 10% probability, you just cannot ignore this alternative. What is this alternative? Is that for 3 decades, we had no inflation, completely dead. Interest rates were at the lower bound, and we had trouble even getting beyond the lower bound with QE and all of that. So it is almost, when you look at the history of this, is 3 decades of low inflation. It's almost guaranteed to surprise you when it comes back, because everybody just believes that there's a secular stagnation and you will never see inflation, and that's it. So nobody really expects a more permanent inflation. However, there are elements that can justify that. For example, is the combination of very loose monetary policy with very expansionary fiscal policy everywhere may at last lead to a more heated labor market. Is it true that wages will go up? And if wages go up, will be much more difficult to control the next step, which is prices going up and inflation. And you may get into a more persistent inflation, given that central banks have committed to be more lenient. I mean, if you look at the Fed and their average inflation target is basically their commitment for loose policy so that they can get rid of the lower bound and the difficulties of low inflation. So it is not a good moment to have a more persistent permanent inflation coming from too loose monetary and fiscal policies. So here we are with 2 camps. One says this is a COVID related, it will eventually fade. The other saying, look, this is too much. You have done too much in the US, you have done too much in advanced economies, and this will lead to a global inflation and eventually to a tightening in policies. And a tightening in policies when you are not really ahead of the curve, when you are willing to wait because you have been three decades with low inflation, because when your framework just tells you that it should fade, it will be a very difficult scenario where interest rates will rise faster instead of just having this tranquility, and that will probably generate more unstable output, more recession afterwards in order to control inflation and all of that. So, Vanessa, the answer to your question is, this is the most important question we're going to face in the very short run. And now the question on Brazil is much easier. How much of this inflation is global? How much is domestic? I mean, of course, global inflation is there, and local issues, fiscal policy, politics, noise, Bolsonaro, and even the central bank being too optimistic about the credibility of, I mean, you gain some credibility, but if you overdo it, you are more ready for surprises. So that's an easier question. I'll say partly is global, partly is local.
Vanessa, if I can pick up on Ilan's question, I think sometime in the 1980s, central banking got its act together, managed to bring down inflation globally. Basically took us to the great financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 with the ability of implementing very strong policy responses, which were very successful and did not de-anchor expectations. And then 10 years later, you have COVID, and you said, well, 2008, 2009 was very successful, so let's do it 2 or 3 times over. Now, when you have that kind of policy reaction over and over again, it's not necessarily the case that people would react with the same way and with expectations remaining as anchored as they were in 2008, 2009. So, and I think there's kind of an Argentine theorem, I like to call it the Argentine theorem, which is that the higher the inflation rate, the larger the number of theories about inflation you have, okay? So inflation goes up and then people start having all kinds of crazy stories as to why you have inflation, and the supply shocks and distributive struggles and the monopoly power. You start, and I'm starting to see all that discussion in the US, which of course I'm used to that discussion in Argentina because we have very high inflation. So we have all kinds of stories all over the place of why there's inflation while the government prints 10% of the money base in a single month, okay? And so to the question of whether, I mean, what's happening now should make us challenge orthodox thinking in monetary policy, I think it's kind of a little bit the opposite, which is that we have to be aware of kind of being alert by all these other kind of stories, potential stories, and kind of focusing on the fundamentals of monetary theory, which I think kind of work pretty well.
Thank you so much. And I'll try to summarize both Pablo and Fabri's questions. So I will ask for the comments of María Antonieta, Felipe, and Andrés in that order, if you please. Basically, they're asking you to elaborate on what you think are the most useful models. Basically, this goes back to our initial question on what kind of macroeconomics is useful for formulating policy, and in particular with an angle on what you see it's more effective perhaps in emerging markets, with an emphasis on the way political economy plays out. So please, María Antonieta first, then Felipe, and finally Andrés.
I think for me was very useful that thinking about intergenerational models. I think that in Latin America, the problem for the next decades will be about pensions. Part of the informality that we have in the labor market will really cost us a lot. We'll have a huge fiscal impact. I think that in Chile, in Peru, there is also like a huge rejection to our model of private funds, like what we call the AFPs. So I think that that the most difficult thing about this huge issue that will have enormous fiscal impact in the following years is that the conversation is being very political and not technical. And that is a huge risk I see for when we think about next generation. And I think that that is very important for Latin America, at least for Peru.
Thank you, María Antonieta. Filipe, please.
Yeah, I have to speak for the growth models, and in particular, I think the endogenous growth models that we cover in the book, because I think for one part, I go back to the point that Tony and Ilan raised, that the issues that are super important, but sometimes kind of might get lost in the urgency of other issues. That's number one. But also because I think the models in themselves, they really help clarify the point I was trying to make, that growth policy is actually very multidimensional, right? So there are many, many different things that are growth policy, right? Immigration has to do with growth policy. Competition has to do with growth policy. Trade has to do with growth policy. All of these things, I think the models help clarify this very, very neatly, right? So that you're kind of illustrating some very big forces, right? Such as, the incentives for innovation, or the role of, the number of people that you have, right? It's what we call scale effect and so on. And they really illuminate this fact that all these different policy issues that seem perhaps disconnected, they all are fundamentally growth policy. So I'm very partial to that particular class of models. I think are very important from a macroeconomic perspective.
And last but not least, of course, our Dean, Andrés Velasco.
Thank you, Vanessa. Very briefly, because we're almost out of time. 3 illustrations of where models make a difference. We begin with pensions, which María Antonieta rightly emphasized. The debate around the world cannot be more heated. It cannot be more confused. A model will not give you the answers, but at least will help you understand a few things. First of all, that the big fight is typically in Latin America, for instance, about who manages the money. If you save, should the savings be handled by the state? Should the savings be handled by a private agent? But that obscures a more fundamental issue, which is pensions is really about savings. Pensions is really about transferring, income today and making it into income tomorrow. But of course, I will not be working tomorrow. So in some sense, I am giving my income when I'm saving to somebody else, and somebody else is giving me his or her income when I retire later on. So relationships of general equilibrium, of intertemporal budgets are absolutely essential. You don't have to use that language. When you say intertemporal, budget constraints, people run for the exits. But the ideas behind those categories are essential for throwing some light into what is otherwise a hugely ideological and hugely confused debate. Another example, which my friend Danny Roderick loves to emphasize, the effect of the minimum wage. When in Chile, there's a tradition that the Minister of Finance every year negotiates with the big unions the increase, the adjustment in the minimum wage. And it was, of course, one of the toughest weeks all year, among other things, because we always negotiated at night. So it'd be 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and you were still in a big conference room arguing about, 0.1% more or less. But there also, it made a big difference if you had people in the room who understood that under some circumstances, increasing the minimum wage can actually create employment if you have a big monopsony buyer. And that's the case that people like David Card, who got the Nobel Prize just last week, have made. But in other circumstances, if the labor market is more or less competitive, an increase in the minimum wage that is too large can destroy employment, and in fact worsen the income distribution, because it will typically destroy the jobs of those who happen to be at the bottom of the pile, and as a result, they will go from having a low income to having no income. And therefore, it is not a discussion of a higher minimum wage is always good or a higher minimum wage is always bad. It depends on circumstances, and a model can help you illuminate that kind of circumstance. Or to touch very briefly on Filipe's favorite issue, growth policy. Again, you get massively ideological debates, not only in Latin America, between people who say, oh, the state should get out and let private businesses invest and lead the creation of capacity and growth. And those who say, oh, the private sector is failing miserably, the state has to step in. Again, a model will give you only a few answers, if any, but at least it will help you understand where is the market failure, where is the government failure, what is the problem you're trying to solve, when will state intervention help a lot, when will state intervention help a little, when will state intervention help not at all and make things worse. It is not a black and white discussion. It is not all or nothing. Typically, the boring economist answer is, it all depends. Now, if you have a model, you can make that a lot more precise. It depends on this and that and that. And in this case, this is the right policy. In the other case, the other policy happens to be the right one. I know this is preaching to the choir here, but it is the sort of thing that can help illuminate debates. One last thought, and I will end, and this is going beyond our book today. It matters a lot what the policymakers say. It matters a great deal what ideas or models the policymakers are using to formulate policy. It also matters a lot, and I think we all learned that, how legitimate and credible the policymaker, the government, and the institutions are. A problem in many places, I used to say in emerging countries, but you can also say this about the United States and many developed countries nowadays, is that most citizens hold politicians and ministers and parties and the state in general in very low esteem. And so perhaps the next book we will write will be all about institutions and how to fix that part of the policy process. But I'm not sure we can write that book in the next 6 months, but give us time, maybe we'll manage to do that. Thank you, Vanessa. Over to you again.
Thank you so much, Andrés. And they're asking us where they can have access to the book. It's on the LSE Open Access Publishing platform on LSE Press. That's, of course, the electronic version, but there's also already a physical book also available. So you can have those options. And thank you so much for our authors and for our speakers for this extraordinary panel. Thank you for all those who kindly join us in this event, and be well and take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Congrats.